Well, hello, good morning, good afternoon, everyone, wherever you are joining us from today. It's Thursday, the 23rd of January, and I'd like to welcome you to this live stream LinkedIn, YouTube, and Teams live event from the Atos Group DE&I Summit, which this year is all about how we can power forward together. My name is Sam Ellis, and I'm the Global Head for Diversity, Equity and Inclusion in our Eviden business, and it's my pleasure to be your host today. I'm a white male with short crop brown hair, and I'm wearing a blue patterned shirt. I'm British and I live out in Alicante in Spain. We also would really love your engagement in today's session, however you're joining us. So please do submit your chat, your questions. It doesn't matter whether you're joining us via the social networks or via Teams. We're going to reserve some time in the discussion to either get to your chat or your questions later in the session. Your chat and engagement is really, really important. So some of you may already have seen the welcome video stream from our executive sponsor, Clay Van Doren, that was released earlier today. And that video highlighted the importance of taking our efforts really to the next level as companies and ensuring that together with our clients and our partners, we're able to ensure progress at pace in a way that drives benefits for all of us as individuals, for our companies, and for society as a whole. So back to this session, and many of you will have seen a rise of what is often being called anti-woke sentiment around the world, and quite a lot of pushback on the topic of DE&I generally. But you will also have witnessed significant progress for people who may have traditionally faced barriers for decades in their companies and in society. But we do need to consider the current political, legislative, cultural, economic landscape to make sure that we are moving forward together in the right way, especially when budgets are always being squeezed, leadership priorities may be changing, and tough decisions need to be made about where investments are made from an employee experience and customer experience perspective. So enough from me. Without further ado, I'd really like to introduce our esteemed panel from the Fellowship of Responsible Business for today's discussion. And to kick us off, none other than the chair for today, Mr. Carl Lyon. So Carl, please come on and describe yourself. Tell us a bit about you and the FRB.
Oh, thank you, Sam. What a lovely introduction. So thank you very much for having us here today, Sam. We're very much looking forward to it. And hello to everybody across the world, wherever you are. I hope you're sitting comfortably and you enjoy the next hour or so. Perhaps why don't I introduce the FRB first, then I'll introduce me afterwards. That seems to make sense. So the Fellowship of Responsibility was really set up a few years ago to help and support responsible businesses and people working within responsible businesses. And we break that down into some key sort of sections. There's customer, there's employee, there's planet, but then there's also the rest of the business. And how does the rest of the business act responsibly? Part of what we do is engaging in this type of debate. And we do it regularly, and Sam has been part of that, Atos has been part of it. Other companies that joined us recently on this type of debate, let's think Atom Bank, Allianz, LV, Insurance, Green King, Hospitality in the UK, Cadent Gas, companies like Spotify, other banks, other councils, all those sort of organisations. So we're drawing on quite a broad spectrum of thoughts. Myself, my name is Carl Lyon. I'm white, British. I live just outside London. I'm a little wider and a little greyer than I used to be. My background, really, I've been doing these debates and discussions for 20 odd years now, and have had the pleasure of doing so with 100, 150 organisations across UK, Europe and into America. During that time, I've met some really great people, had a lot of exposure to a lot of interesting thoughts and ideas. 3 of those people are joining me today, which is terrific. So we've got Sam, who you've already met, and we've got Stuart and Maria, who are joining me as well. They're also part of the FRB with me. So perhaps, Sam, I could introduce Stuart and Maria. Perhaps Stuart first.
Good morning, everyone. Stuart Bromley. Thank you for the introduction, Carl. Just as a very tiny background, I've got over 35 years experience working in blue chip corporate internationally. But on top of that, I guess some of the highlights was First Direct, where not only did I sort of manage all the digital estate for a few years, but I also looked after HR. So I've got a background in sort of technology and change, but I've also got a background in people and culture and cultural change. And then more recently, I spent 8 years. In fact, I was the very first employee at Atom Bank, and I was the chief operations officer and chief technology officer there for my 8 years. Again, responsible not just for all the technology and all the services, but also HR as well. So it's been great to hear. It'd be lovely to share some of my experience today.
Perfect. And for people that can't see Stuart, he's very similar to me, white male, just a few years younger and a little better looking, I would say. How about Maria? Can we introduce Maria?
Hi, everybody. Good morning. Bom dia. I am Maria McCann. Absolutely delighted to be on the panel this morning. For those who need an audio description, I'm a white female with short brown hair, and I don't look like Carl or Stuart. Thank you, but that's no insult to them.
Give it a few more years, Maria.
My background has been spent the last 20 years working for and with fast-growing startups. So I was with companies like ASOS and Spotify at their sort of start of their, let's say, perhaps under 150 employees. So really at the start of their scaling up process. So my sort of experience is all about operationalizing and taking practices that can be used in a startup environment into perhaps more heritage organizations and seeing how we can apply those. I've spent the last 10 years building and running multiple businesses globally, and joined forces with Carl and Stuart to try and help these organizations and teams and individuals of all shapes and sizes to just really start to think about their responsibilities within the workplace and how they make decisions, sometimes courageous decisions, that are for the benefit of them, their teams and their businesses. So that's what we're trying to do. Okay,
so are we still connected? I had a little bit of an interference on there. We're still connected. Okay, great. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Stuart. So as I discussed earlier, or mentioned earlier, we've been debating this for a little while, and over the last year, we've had a lot of exposure to it. I thought what I'd like to do is just go around everybody to start with, including you, Sam, if I may, to just see where we are and what we've taken out of the last debates, the last 3 or 4 debates. As always, perhaps I could start with you, Stuart. What's your sort of overview of the recent history and where we are? Then we can see how we move it forward.
I definitely think companies are definitely progressing on a number of fronts. I think it's natural, I think, for companies to focus initially on their sort of their DE&I initiatives on, I guess, addressing what I would call, bad behavior, so, fixing the basics, getting to a state of zero tolerance where you don't tolerate, the negative behaviors, and that's an important place to start, because if you don't have zero tolerance, you pretty much undermine everything else you do. So you've got to start somewhere, and it's a great place to start. And certainly many companies have made huge strides in terms of getting the basics right. That doesn't mean, and I think this is where the next phase is, that they're truly valuing difference, valuing diversity, and by that I mean, how do they capitalize on the fact they have a much more engaged, much more enriched workforce? Are they now really becoming an employer brand of choice to be a safe place to be, to attract very diverse talent? And by diverse, I don't just mean the sort of the usual characteristics. I'm talking about neurodiversity in particular, so as to be able to create some really, incredible, extraordinary talent for very specific types of activities and roles in their business that will then differentiate and outperform against their peer group. So I think that's where the next phase is. I think the next phase is how do you actually truly value and capitalize on this versus just fixing the basic behaviors.
Yeah, okay, I really agree, Stuart, with a whole load of that. Maria, what are your thoughts from recent discussions?
Well, I mean, look, if you think about where we were 30, 20, 10, even 5 years ago, I think anybody that's contributed to this space and the progress that's been made really should take heart with where the workplace is today, and how people coming into the workplace view each other, employers, employees, colleagues, stakeholders, compared to perhaps 5 or 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. So much progress has been made, and I don't think we should forget that. What I do think needs to happen now, though, is a sort of some reflection on perhaps some unintended consequences that may have occurred due to due to the need to kind of really swing towards progress. There are some dangers of kind of this area being perceived as the morality police. And so we need to sort of reflect on, is that really where we want to be, or is that it? And how do we move past that? And then, like Stuart said, how do we then move into even more individual kind of relationship between employer and employee? How do we really create that sort of ability to treat everybody as an individual? Because that's, as at a human level, that's really where we want to be. So that's what I would say is a sort of period of reflection, and then really grasping the things that we want to accelerate on in terms of like Stuart said, capitalizing on the successes of diversity and diverse thinking for ourselves and our businesses and our teams.
Thank you, Maria. Just a quick question, I'll come to Sam. Just reflect on what you said there, Maria. Do you think in some ways the business environment is ahead of society? You seem to be indicating there that the business environment maybe has moved quicker than society has.
Yes, possibly. It's more, let's say, it's probably laid down its structures more quickly than perhaps society.
Okay, we'll come back to that. Thank you, I just wanted to get your thoughts. So, Sam, where from your position, you've got a huge in-depth of knowledge and experience here. Where do you think we are, the good and the bad and the ugly?
So I'll be bold first of all, and I see in our comments we've got a really eclectic audience joining us. We've got a couple of people saying hello, bon dia, as you kindly also said, Maria, at the start. Sao Paulo and maybe somewhere else in Brazil. We've got people from Malaysia, Poland. So welcome everybody. Please do keep the chat coming in. It's always nice to see. My position is this at the moment, in that I am still keeping a very, very open mind, and as I recommend everyone does, on this topic. It almost feels that we're almost ready, as I'm reading about a lot, for DE&I 2.0, and recognizing what this means for the world. Everything that Stuart said about how we value difference was, for me, tick, 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 absolutely. How can we really use that power of diversity in how we innovate, how we produce great products and experiences that appeals to a much broader audience and much broader customer base? And really what Maria said, again, I couldn't agree more with, in terms of an individualized approach, and actually great managers are all about that, in terms of how we value and motivate people as individuals as well as a collective. And I think, let's address the elephant in the room to an extent and realize that yes, businesses arguably have been moving very fast and are often driven by customer expectations in both public and private sector around this, in terms of our ethical, moral, societal responsibilities towards how we assist traditionally disadvantaged or groups that have experienced barriers, whether it's into the tech sector or in executive roles generally, etc. But I think we're seeing already, this rise of, as I mentioned, of sort of anti-woke sentiment around the world that we have to listen to, and how we choose to act, and that is obviously, what many people in the DE&I world and organisations generally would be thinking of. But I think what everybody can agree on is that we are all different, and we all need and value and are motivated by slightly different things, and how we can tap into that is going to be really, really key to how we attract, how we hire, select, and how we develop and retain the very best people. And I think all I would say before I hand back to you, Carl, is a lot of people who are maybe not so much of a proponent in DE&I often talk about meritocracy, and often when you plough a bit deeper around what an understanding of meritocracy is, that's often fraught with issues in terms of what meritocracy really means, and how we can make sure that we genuinely are searching far and wide for the very best people to do our jobs that would be naturally more diverse, and hopefully inclusive with it. So that's what I'd say. Thank
you, Sam. Interesting listening to all of you there. I think everyone's fairly optimistic about where we are. We should be. The question I asked Maria, and I asked you, Sam, as well, do we think businesses are ahead of society? And as a supplement to that, and always watch out for the supplementary questions, Sam, is do we think that's because the legislation has driven companies to be more proactive on this than society is? Is that what you've seen?
To an extent, yes, but this also varies on the geography, because around the world, every country is at a different maturity level, or comes from a different perspective. So we have all sorts of legislation now in various countries in Europe, also in North America, around things like the gender pay gap and how we report that. For example, average earnings of men versus women in companies, for example, as well as expectations from a procurement perspective, and how we're judged by our respective governments to be prioritising investments. So to an extent, yes, I've definitely seen that.
Okay, so in that case, I think we're following a familiar pattern here with anything that of this nature that comes into the business world and into society, that it goes through phases of growth, and I think that's what Stuart was saying. If people will sort of wind back customer experience, it went through the same growing pains where you had people not moving towards it, but people being told to do it. And then you had quotas in place, and you had data, and you had all the challenge on that. Then you had the pushback. And to a certain extent, we all know we're having the pushback is very rife today. And that's really the same as with customer experience. We need to move on to somewhere that people are moving towards it. And it's about me. It's more inclusive. So the inclusive side of it is perhaps where we need to move, so that we've got less resistance on it, and it's not about those people over there. Oh, this has a meaning for me, and that's the basis of the discussion we had about rebranding ED&I a little while ago. Sam, Stuart, where are you, Stuart, on this? Because I know we've talked over the years about this, about how do we move to something that is more inclusive, and that people will move towards rather than seeing as a threat to them?
Well, I think the answer there is how do you systemically change the culture of organization that is completely inclusive in nature? Now, that's easy said and not necessarily as easy done. Respect is a wonderful thing. Many people are taught respect from an early age, and it's like treat others the way you'd want to be treated, which actually, ironically, is the most disrespectful thing you can do. Because if you want to respect someone, you should be treating them the way they want to be treated. You have to decenter, and that's, I think, key to this. Because I think the whole point of being inclusive is your ability to switch off what your preferences are, what you value, and switch on what the other person or people around you want, need, and prefer, right? And that requires education, because as human beings, we're innately programmed to be sort of comfortable with people like us, people like ourselves, who think like us, and our brains are wired, if you've got gaps or voids, is to fill those voids with your own preferences, your own judgments, your own conditioning. And actually, it requires education. So back to your question, I think you can't just rest on your laurels, think you've made it, because as human beings, we'll just fall back into our old ways. You have to continually educate, challenge, provoke people to feel uncomfortable by surrounding them with people who are different to them, right? And that they value that difference, that they can tap into that difference, that they're prepared to switch off their own preferences. And whether that's sort of education in unconscious bias, or whether that's education in terms of how to decenter, how to switch off, how to stop being judgmental, is absolutely key, and something that you just can't stop. It has to be continually pushed and driven to make sure that change is sustained and managed for forever.
Yeah, and that's for some people that's quite a difficult journey, Stuart. Both of us are trained coaches, and so we've had the insight on how to do that. But the good thing is it's a one-off journey. Once you've broken those and you're engaging with people in a fresh way, so that you can evaluate what they can bring and their strengths and their weaknesses and their talents. Once you can do that, then a lot of these problems, I guess, start to melt away. But how do we promote that in a way that is going to be effective, but also be quantifiable? How do we see it happening? I think that's the challenge here. If we leave it to that type of area, how do we see it happening? How do we know it happens?
Well, ultimately, the success measurement in this is your ability to attract and retain talent, to have a much more engaged, enriched workforce that outperforms and that continually innovates at a higher pace, at a higher level than your competitor group, right? So I think there's numerous ways that you can measure success, but I think it is the measurement of that which is the value of this, more so than measuring quotas and numbers, which I think is where companies fell into various traps and trends over the last sort of 15 years, right? It's valuing the difference at the heart of your business is key.
Interesting, because quotas and things have perhaps I'll come to you on that, Sam, because I agree with you, Stuart, but the quotas and things have accelerated it in a lot of areas. And Sam, you mentioned promoting the right people with the right talents. Do you think quotas and things are getting in the way of that now? Do you think it's time we move past it, or do we still need them?
So, I mean, and there's all sorts of misconceptions around quotas versus targets, etc. And in some countries, particularly in Europe, for example, there are legal requirements from a quota perspective. For example, a number of women on executive boards in some countries, particularly in Scandinavia, for example, as well as the number of people with disabilities that are employed by large organisations. And the legislation is the legislation, and how we work with it is another matter. I think where the problems sometimes occur is this challenge of having an objective, an ambition, or a target that is based on what should be achievable. In a perfect world, by searching high and low for the very best people, we should arguably have a more representative workforce. but only through searching, not box ticking, and finding somebody that fits a quota. So I think that for me is the big thing. We have an element of legislation that we need to work towards in respective countries, and we operate in nearly 60 countries. So you can only imagine the differences. And we also have reporting challenges in different countries as well. So where we're expected by customers and governments to be reporting on not just gender, but things like ethnicity and disability in some countries like the UK or the US. We cannot do that in much of the rest of the world for legal reasons, around data usage. So it is problematic, but also I also understand the argument that unless you really have a tangible but achievable objective or a vision around what the future needs to look like, some people might argue that companies aren't necessarily taking the topic seriously. So and it just becomes an aspiration that is never realized. So I'm not one for absolutely hiring anybody because of any particular protected characteristic, but I am one for making sure that we're not using the same old channels to find people to be recruited, if that makes sense. So how can we make sure that we're genuinely being rigorous, we're genuinely going to parts of the world or parts of society that we've not touched before to see if there's untapped talent that would do the job better than anybody else. So yeah, that's what I would say.
I absolutely agree, Sam. And you need all these different levers. As we discussed, in a lot of ways, businesses are ahead of society. So a lot of these levers have done really good things. It's interesting to know how some organizations want to meet a target and other organizations want to achieve something. Mm-hmm. And those are very different. And the thing to look out for is companies that always hit the target. It was the same in the early days of customer and people experience. Companies would hit the target, and if you had to get a 25% quota, they got 25%. They never got 30, they never got 40, they never got 100, they never got anything else, right? So that's one thing to look at. But we do need to find a way, and like with customer bit, once people move past, they get past the quota and they outperform the quota. So we're now moving into a place where if we can get this right, companies can outperform the quota just by very nature of what they're doing, because quotas usually set, Sam, as you said, around what's achievable. Mm-hmm. So if we can move past that and we can outperform this, and we can look back at the quotas and say, well, they were good at the time, but we've moved way past it. So if we're talking about getting the right people in because they have the right skills, Maria, perhaps you can comment on that, because some of the things you've discussed in the past have been really good on this. How do you get the right focus on the right person for the job?
Well, it's not easy. It's the first thing.
Thank you for that, Maria.
Because when you have a hiring strategy, if that hiring strategy promotes the safest path to hiring, the safest path to recruitment, then you will get the safest candidates, but you will not get the best candidates necessarily. And so I think where I've tried in the businesses that I've worked in and for and run is to look at the sort of risk versus reward in terms of your hiring strategy. So I've hired people that have had no CVs, that that have across the world, because they didn't know how to write one, but they were dependable, they were coachable, they had lots of energy to bring to work, and they were a good fit for the team. So how do you fit that into a hiring strategy? You can't necessarily. So I think what I would say is to look at two things within the hiring strategy. How much are you de-risking, and what will the outcome of that? If you were to simulate the outcome, then what would that likely to be? Because the more you de-risk the strategy, the less likely you are to find the best people. You would find the safest people, and maybe that's enough, and that's okay. And the second thing I would look at, just going back to this sort of measures versus targets, is I think it was Charles Goodhart, who's an economist in the UK, said when a measure becomes the target, it stops becoming a good measure. And so looking at what are you actually looking to achieve? What is your goal here versus what do you want to track over time to see how things are playing out, and just letting them play out according to your strategy. So that's how I would sort of tackle it. I'd look at my hiring strategy, the sort of risk versus reward, and then the goal that I'm looking to achieve versus what I'm happy to let play out, and just track over time and see where I need to adjust.
Interesting. There's lots of bits of that. I like the risk and reward. Hi to everyone in India and all sorts of places that I'm coming, and I'm very impressed with the viewers around the world. It's fantastic. It's amazing when we talk about responsible business. We are not talking of de-risking a business. We're not talking just be safe. Sometimes you have to take a risk, and that's an interesting concept to bring in there. Stuart, over the years, you've had many instances where you've looked at the recruitment side of things and getting the right people. What can you add to Maria's thoughts?
Yeah, and it is because I agree wholeheartedly with what Maria just said. I think a lot of companies fall into the trap that they look specifically at their hiring process, namely how they select, and they're trying to make sure that the selection process is has equality at the heart of it. It's fair. But I think that although that's fine, it's almost too late in the process. What I would urge companies to think about is that the role profile itself. What is the role? How do you make sure you've got enough flexibility in the role so that you can play to an individual talent? So that you should be talent led, not role led. Where do you advertise that role, and how do you advertise that role? Because those three things, the role profile, where you advertise, how you advertise, will almost certainly dictate who you manage to acquire, right? And actually, the broader that game, the broader that you appeal, the more you outreach to the different diverse communities that you can touch, the more you allow people to apply, back to Maria's point, with CV, without CV, to a job description that has much more flexibility in it, so that people can apply their talent to the role rather than try and fit to a role. The more likely you're going to bring in some real talent that has very specialist capabilities to strengthen your teams, right? So I think much of the effort has been in selection, and I would urge people to think much more about the profile of the role itself, and actually who you advertise, how you advertise, where you advertise.
So I fully agree with you, Stuart. I'd like to give a health warning. When Stuart says you need to think about the profile, you really do need to think about the profile. And I know the way you've done it in the past, Stuart, and you need to think about what you need from that person and what they can bring and what they're going to deliver and to the company, and how that's going to be beneficial for the company. If you do that at a very surface level, you don't get the results. And we want to move on to talk about budgets and things, Sam, etc. What Stuart and Maria are talking about here is something that does lead into those budgets, because you start to build a better team. And if you build a better team, and I know, Stuart, you've run some fantastic teams, and you, Maria, those people outperform. When you were a small part of a large banking group, Stuart, your team outperformed the major part of the bank, and that was in a great deal to do with getting the right people in. You were head of people experience, I think, at that point for that company. So if you get those people in, then you start to change where we look at budgets and what we're getting back from this. So the other part of the equation here is, where are we looking for the budgets to do this stuff? And now I think perhaps I'd like your thoughts, perhaps to you first, Sam. Where are your thoughts here on how that side of the argument moves on? can we advance that to really showing and delivering business benefits that people will then readily pay for and be throwing thousands of dollars at you?
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, it's the $1 million question. I think that many sort of DEI enthusiasts or professionals will be asking about how they can take this into their organizations. And I think there are different ways of skinning the same cat, if that makes sense, for want of a better phrase. And I think there is so much correlational, and I stress correlational, not causational, correlational evidence. We quoted the McKinsey reports on an earlier session today, around demonstrating how more, diverse leadership teams are, exponentially more successful in terms of business growth, etc. I stress there's no causational evidence there, but I think what it is safe to say is that there is zero evidence that says that more diverse organizations make business performance worse. So, so that for me is quite important from perhaps an ethical and moral standpoint. But I think in terms of the cost of poor hiring decisions is something that's now getting easier to quantify. So we're able to see, straight away, how much did it cost to advertise, to recruit, how much was the lost productivity in getting a new person up to speed, purely because we may have recruited somebody that was like us, that fitted in, rather than was necessarily what the team needed in terms of, mindset and what that person was bringing in. And how we actually crunch those numbers, I think, is getting easier, and I think is what, HR professionals, recruitment professionals, talent acquisition professionals, we need to collectively get a little bit better at, so that we're able to say, hang on, if we invest another €10,000, $10,000 here, in making a more rigorous, less biased, hiring process, then we're 5 times more likely to get the right person first time and not be having the same conversation in 6 months when that person leaves because the job wasn't for them. So I think that's the one thing I would say, that I think we probably all need to get a little bit smarter around the cost of poor hiring decisions.
It's amazing, isn't it, Stuart? Sam. When you look, you will find the data. It's a case of going to look, because you're absolutely right. A turnover of staff is very expensive. It leads us also onto this theme of getting the right people in, attracting the right talent. Companies used to be able to rely on, to a certain extent, getting local people in, using the local workforce. But now we just bring a little bit into this mix is the hybrid working situation, remote working, which we now is increasing exponentially. That means that there are more people available, so you can go and get and reach different communities and different individuals than you could reach before. So once again, I think this starts to challenge, back to Stuart's point, what is the role, and what are they doing, and how are they going to perform? Because you're not just saying, right, we've got 100 people and we've put them in the office environment and it will sort itself out. We'll put good managers in place. We've broken that model now. So I think this is going to be another thing that's going to power ED&I in the future, is that the selection of people has changed dramatically. So again, it starts to challenge us as to what criteria are we hiring people on, and how do we know those people are going to perform? What are your thoughts, Maria, on that side of things, on the performance that you're getting from your team? Is it something that we can quantify, or is it still an instinctive thing that we know who's are good employees and who are not as effective?
Well, I mean, yeah, we can quantify performance if we're clear about the jobs that someone comes in to do for the business, if we're clear about how people are expected to interact with each other, and if everybody's clear with each other about that, and if people are clear about what they want from the workplace as well, and what we don't all want, I think sometimes it's important to talk about what's not on the table from a workplace and a performance perspective, because otherwise a vacuum occurs and people make assumptions, and then assumptions turn into rituals, and rituals turn into culture, right?
Yeah.
So I think we can absolutely quantify performance from a point of view of data, from a point of view of observation, from a point of view of interaction with colleagues, but those things have to be able to be pretty transparent and communicated and reviewed and adjusted on a regular basis, because a business doesn't stay the same. So we shouldn't expect, so expectations shouldn't stay the same, but we have to, communication is the key for me in that process.
I agree. And interesting in what you said there, we have to set a standards on how people interact with each other. And
those standards don't, sorry, Carl, those standards don't necessarily need to be set by the employer.
I was just that you read my mind completely. That's an interesting one, isn't it? Because we've all seen companies trying to write those standards down, but that's not something that's written down. That's how we interact, how we're respectful for each other, and we're coming around to respect, Stuart, which is one of your favourite subjects. But respect, if we are all respecting each other and it's respecting each other's differences, we no longer have any problems. Now that's easy to say, right? But how do we move towards that?
So just before you move on, a practical thing that I would always look at is the type of relationship that let's say two colleagues might have. I mean, I do this a lot between customers and businesses, which is to look at it. Is that relationship operating in a sort of adult-child environment? So is one party telling the other what to do, and the other party's maybe doing it or acting out sometimes, or not, but they don't really have a space to sort of come back and a mutual agreement to be agreed? Or are those two parties, let's say two employees or employee, are they acting in a sort of where there's equal dialogue, where there's an equal value of transaction and respect happening? And if it's the sort of adult child, then you've got work to do. So that would be the first step I would take in my company, to say, is this operating in an adult child or an adult? How are these relationships working? Because adult is high trust. Yeah. Adult child is low trust.
And it's a very different relationship. So yes. we're trying to move companies into, are we trying to move companies into a space they're not familiar with? Because we're trying to get to a state, as Sam has said, we're trying to get to EDI version 2. And this means we need to seriously move people into something that outperforms the legislation. So how do we get into a space where people are respecting each other? How do we grow that? And I know I'm saying all this in the presence of Stuart Bromley, who has a lot of experience of this. So Stuart, I'm going to let you loose on this subject, but I'm only going to give you 5 minutes.
Well, I think I think a lot of it comes down to some of your core policies and practices, and I think from a policy perspective, I'm talking about some of the core HR people-related policies here. There's some direct policies. There's 3 levels of policies. I mean, there's the direct stuff, which is things like dignity at work, bullying and harassment, discrimination, maternity, paternity, all the usual type things. But then even more so, more powerful on this stuff is the indirect policies. These are things around your flexible working practices, your holidays, your inclusive language and communication policies, accessibility, flexible benefits, all sorts of things that will absolutely appeal much more to individualism, which is what you're trying to get to. So I think there's that sort of level. there's a third level of practices that you can do, which is not to do with policies, but how do you still, collaboration and sharing across diverse work groups. And I've worked in environments where we've introduced blind dating, where people from very different teams will spend a day together and learn each other, what they do, how they do it, why they do it. And all you're doing there is you're creating a much more broader understanding around the various different roles and activities that go on in a business, that creates much greater empathy and much greater inclusivity. And then finally, the last level that I think people need to focus on is some of the core HR construct disciplines themselves. So back to that role profile, if you're going to create much more flexible role profiles, because role profiles often drive things like decisions around basic pay, for example. If you've role profile driven as a team, and this is very corporate oriented, this is what tends to happen, then pay will be fixed against that role profile, and you're just trying to fit everybody against a role profile. If you're talent/individual led, then you can be much more flexible about the role that someone actually does, right? And this is much more the case if you look at small organizations, small entrepreneur organizations. They don't have fixed role profiles. You tend to join the team as a talented individual, and you pick up responsibilities that play to your talents, right? And actually, therefore, you need to have much greater flexibility in how you do things like pay, performance, objectives, all these sorts of core HR things are swung completely on its head, where you take a talent view of the world versus taking a role view of the world. And therefore, I would urge some of the more broader corporate businesses to be much more talent driven and have much greater flexibility in their HR constructs that go with that, versus taking a sort of a one size fits all corporate stance.
So that I agree fully with what you're saying. That opens the door on inclusivity. It doesn't necessarily mean that people are going to walk through it. So what I mean by that is you've got to also be careful that, and you've got to put things actively in place so that the candidates that you're receiving represent inclusivity. So I think we had a bit of a chat on this, did we not, Sam, a little while ago, that how do you, because I'm absolutely agreeing with Stuart, but you need to have the pool of people you're looking at to be inclusive. Is that the key to this? So that you can employ on talent, is it that we need to have some rules around inclusivity for the talent pool that we're looking at? What are your thoughts on that, Sam?
Yeah, I mean, of course, I don't know whether rules is the right word.
Yeah, I agree with that. Rules.
How we do it, yeah. But I think, a good start, for example, is actually just expanding the view of where we think that pool may exist in the first place. So, many years ago, for example, organizations like ourselves were very much focused on the very cream of the crop, traditional, what we call red brick universities, the Oxbridges, the Harvards, to secure our absolute top talent. And of course, there's some amazing talent in those organizations, in those institutions, but there's also amazing talent in other places which have traditionally never been looked at, so it could be, underprivileged areas where there's just as talented people, but maybe they've not had the same opportunities. And we need to give different approaches, hence why we've had success with things like apprenticeships in different countries, rather than getting graduates from the same places. So I think that's really important. And also in hiring and application, how we can make the application process more inclusive, less intimidating for people, so that we're not putting off people that may be super valuable without being too put by a really complicated web form, for example. I think we still have some work to do there, but I think that's what I'd say is absolutely look at casting the net wider and looking at different places, and then making the process itself more approachable, really, and more accessible in every aspect. And I think in tech it's very difficult because we always like people that are certified and have got knowledge in particular areas, but there's also that opportunity to question what we can better train on later if we get people with the right inherent sort of values and curiosity levels, etc. So it's a hugely complicated area, particularly in tech.
I empathise with that, Sam. I come from an engineering background. If I look back 30 years, it was it's no surprise I ended up as an engineer. To broaden that pool was very difficult and took a lot of time and a lot of conscious effort. And I think that's where conscious effort is really needed to get people involved, to get just on the basic level, to get women involved in that environment was extremely difficult. And a lot of people now that we see, Caden Gass and people, they've got so many more girls and women involved in engineering, but they've had to go right back. And we also need to take this then into education. And there's a lot of work with some people who are doing DING, who are looking at how do we make education fit to get people that are fit to move into our working opportunities. So I think it's a responsibility of business to go out to education and say, hang on, this needs to change, because we want a diverse pool of people that we can pick the best talent from. We don't want you to select us down to a small group that we then pick the best talent from. So I think companies also ought to be very conscious of what education is doing in their particular region or their country, and see if they can influence that. Let's go back to this, if we can, the budgeting debate. Sam, you can answer this better than anyone else, I guess, at the moment. How is ED&I funded? What's the business case for it? What's the return on investment currently? What's the typical sort of standard on that?
Varies very much across different organisations, and normally budgets are around for events, initiatives, what we call positive action or affirmative action in the US, for things like coaching and mentoring opportunities, where a particular disadvantaged group may need a little bit of help to level the playing field in terms of opening up some opportunities. But I think generally, my view, and I think Clay, some people may have caught Clay Van Doren's speech, his presentation video this morning, is some of it's a little bit old news in terms of some people may argue that it's, why are we justifying why do we saying that we need a business case for what should be the right thing to do in the first place, if that makes sense. So why are we having to justify X amount of spend to have a workforce that is broadly within the realms of possibility representative of the society and the clients that we serve? And so for me, it's more about, I think everyone needs to get better at their success stories, which we talked about in a previous session today, as well, in terms of how we're highlighting achievements of everybody within the organisation, within our companies. But in terms of budgets that are set aside, it feels like this is very much what we were doing 10 years ago, where we were giving communities, or ERGs, as we call them, employee resource groups, money for sweets and treats, if you like. And yeah. I think there's still maybe a place for that, for running particular events, but now I think the broader investments are in coaching and mentoring, in better hiring, better marketing, in even things like how we reduce unconscious bias and sexism in things like job descriptions, tools to help us do that. But there is no standard. There's no standard X% of budget per employee that we would spend on this sort of thing.
It's a difficult subject, isn't it, Sam? And you're absolutely right. We shouldn't have to look for budget, because it should happen automatically, but the truth is it doesn't. And also the what we're perhaps seeing pushback against now is that people aren't seeing the value. So back to Stuart's point, we need to be demonstrating the value of this, of getting the best talent pool. So we need coming through our organisations that people are saying, "Wow, that person's really good. That's a really high performing person," but it's changing the perception. So that's what we need to do. Stuart, and your experience, how do we move that? I feel in this version, the second version, the V2, that conversation needs to change. What's your thoughts on changing that conversation around budgets and things?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think that the actual budgets you require from a DE&I specific function is actually relatively minimal. If you compare that to the, it's just to say hiring, let's just take one aspect of this whole equation. Your hiring budgets, your cost of acquisition are enormous potentially compared to a DE&I budget. And actually, we're not saying that you suddenly need to spend twice the amount of money on acquisition. All the D&I function is doing is saying how we spend that acquisition budget should be done in a different way to appeal to acquire better talent and retain talent, for longer, right? So actually, the amount of money you need for D&I is relatively small beer. All we're doing is making sure the monies that are spent naturally in a business are spent much more wisely, right? And actually then the definition of then how you justify that is back to what we said. It's about making sure you can actually look at your retention of talent. You can look at your cost of acquisition of talent. You can look at performance. You can look at engagement. You can do all these things that again are core business measures that should demonstrate that actually you're getting better at this sort of stuff. You're getting better talent that lasts longer.
Perfect. Thank you, Stuart. We're going to have to start wrapping up now. So I'll take that as your wrap up because it was extremely good. Maria, your sort of wrap up on this conversation.
I mean, very, very quickly, my wrap up on the conversation. Thank you guys for a great conversation. Is let's reflect on what's worked and what hasn't. Let's be brutally honest about it. Let's see what we want to take into, the 2.0 version that Sam's been talking about. And let's start really focusing on outcomes and individual relationships beyond the sort of metrics and quotas and targets that we've sort of laid down in the corporate environment to date. It's got us where we need to be, but now's the time to move into a different space, I think.
Excellent. Sam, shall I do a wrap up and then pass it back to you? Is that probably the best way to do it?
That'd be amazing. Thank you.
Okay. So thank you, guys. I say great conversation. Thank you for all the comments. Sorry I haven't got to all the comments that people have come in, but I'm very optimistic about where we're going. What I'd say is the future does look different, and that's a natural evolution. That we've got to celebrate what we're doing, but we've got to look at what are we going to do differently to move the subject on so that it outperforms the regulatory environment and that sort of stuff, which is where we got to with customer. So I think we can do it, but we can't just hang on to what we've done. We have to really think about what we've done. Has it been effective? Can we do something different in the future? And I agree with Stuart and Maria. That's around personalization. It's about talent. It's about plugging into the core performance metrics of your business. That's me. Thank you, Sam.
Okay, Carl, thank you very much. Maria, thank you, as well as for Stuart, for your views on all of this today. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you. I really, really appreciate it. Some great debate and really great to see such a global audience joining us as well with their comments. Thank you very much indeed. So I'll wrap up now. I'm going to thank everyone that has joined us, whether you are on YouTube, LinkedIn, or Teams live event for the session today. But we've still got a day full of events still to come up. So coming up right after this, for those of you that are joining us via Teams, we've got a really great session on how we explore environmental sustainability through a more intersectional lens. We're also going to be talking a little bit later at 3 p.m. CET on how we enhance well-being and support for underrepresented groups in the workplace. And then we're also going to be coming back on LinkedIn and YouTube later to talk about how we can thrive together through every season on the topic of inclusion and belonging, before we move over to our North America team, who are going to be talking about how we can change the narrative together to really understand the meaning and importance of DE&I. And then finally, Larissa and myself, as the two DE&I heads of the organisation, will be doing a great little wrap up at 6:30 CET to what will have been a really great day. So thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you later on in the day if you can make it. And Carl, Maria, Stuart, it's been a pleasure. Take care. Bye-bye now.
Thank you.